Hi everyone, I'm going to talk to you today about OpenCAPI. I plan to give you a better understanding of the reason for needing a new memory fabric and then highlight OpenCAPI's strengths for a pure data-centric world. So let's start with the basics. We all recognize this CPU-centric architecture, so much so it's a generational religion. We have the memory bus, which is latency critical and bandwidth critical. The processor interconnect buses that are all proprietary, that are latency critical and bandwidth critical. Then we have storage attach, which is more latency tolerant and bandwidth tolerant. And finally, we have the network attach, which is frequently latency relaxed and bandwidth critical. So essentially we've got as an analogy, the internal combustion engine car is a very similar thing. It's been around for decades, and it's really it is great at what it does, and often you don't need to change it. However, we've seen this data-centric shift going on over the last 15 years or so, where we've got memory in a CPU-centric world. What I mean by that is, well, essentially the interconnect bus is a coherent memory interconnect to start with. We're seeing that storage is becoming persistent memory, more so as we go forward. And we're even seeing that we're remotely connecting memory over the network. So a better way to represent this would be these different buses just connecting to memory. In a way, this blend of this data-centric and CPU-centric world is a bit like a hybrid electric gas car, such as the Toyota Prius. And let's face it, the Prius has been around for 20 years. It made a lot of sense. It's a good way to evolve from one world to the next. But we shouldn't forget that there are several compromises that we have to put up with. We have complex logic translations going on between all these different buses. And it's really a wasteful use of the I/O resources on the processors, and not only that, if we look at the cost of our data-centric servers these days, we find we're spending the vast majority of the money on the memory infrastructure, and very little, relatively speaking, on the processor. So really, we're getting to a situation where the tail is wagging the dog. So ideally, we'd like to converge these memories and put them all together into a tiered memory infrastructure on one new memory bus. And we need to get the best of all the performance we need is the lowest possible latency still, high bandwidth, and really scalable. And we shouldn't forget that the memory is not existent in a single point. It is certainly a data plane continuum. 1 nanosecond per foot to 134 milliseconds for light to travel around the world. So we need to take this into account in our system, in our data-centric world. But what about the PCI bus? It's a peripheral component interconnect. We're increasingly seeing peripherals being absorbed into the CPU, and that becoming more of an SoC device. And really, even the Ethernet now is becoming directly coupled into the processor. So we're looking at a systems on a chip CPU rather than purely just a CPU. And the PCI is becoming a legacy bus, which is all very well. But one thing we shouldn't do is we shouldn't compromise our new memory bus. It's latency critical memory bus with unnecessary legacy support. We really need to keep that clean. So pulling that all together, we get this data-centric core building block, a really clean slate when we really look at data-centric purely and don't worry about legacy. A bit like an electric car, it looks really pure. And OpenCAPI is that new memory bus. It offers this lowest possible latency, high bandwidth, and is very scalable. So, but what about other processors, accelerators? We've got peer processors. I tend to call them peer processors or SoC variants. They come in the different flavors, CPU and GPU, and FPGA and AI. Really, you can categorize them into two separate categories: latency critical, really von Neumann processors, and you've got to get over that von Neumann bottleneck, and hence the coherence critical part of this. And then the AI and FPGA are more latency relaxed streaming processors, and they're often used for data reduction filtering functions. And coherence is frequently unnecessary unless you've got a tightly coupled accelerator to a CPU trying to accelerate a single thread. So putting that all together, we end up with a distributed memory data plane and all the different processors attached to it. So really we've got a heterogeneous distributed computing going on here. And we can see this really at the rack scale or all the way up to the data center scale, and it would look something like this. But we can now see that this is truly data centric in our thinking of how to represent this. And increasingly, if we look at the buzzwords around, we've got the cloud, the edge, and the intelligent IoT, Internet of Things. And I've just highlighted here that often with so much data coming from the IoT, like CCTV cameras, etc., you often want to just filter out the information that you need and only offer that to your data plane continuum, like maybe extracting faces from video or number plates, etc., rather than sending all of the video into your memory structures. And that's often driven by the comms bandwidths available or the cost management that you've got. So really we're talking about a generic system level domain specific architecture here. And this is an area that I specialize in with my consulting company, Nalisway. So here, this is really the core building block we should think of as we go forward with computing. So great concept, but the reality? Well, the reality is that OpenCAPI is a production-ready memory fabric today. OpenCAPI is the third generation that was deployed in 2014. The OpenPOWER initiative focused on data-centric open community innovation right from the very start. So we've been looking at the pure data-centric approach all the way back then. This is not just a spec that's yet to be finalized. We've had a lot of work in progress, a lot of learning, a good few mistakes on the way, and but we're here today with a really effective bus, and it's showing lots of promise. The OpenCAPI PHY is fundamentally an 8 transceiver lane bus with a few sideband signals. 25 gigabits per second has been in production since 2018 and introduced with Power 9. And it's the only bus that's highly focused on the lowest possible latency in point-to-point interconnect. OpenCAPI is also introduced this open memory interface, OMI differential DIMMs, that were introduced in 2019. And in my view, this is a game changer piece of the OpenCAPI infrastructure. So putting that pictorially, what's in production today, the Power 9 and the Xilinx FPGAs, and we've got this OpenCAPI interconnect and the memory sharing going on here. Additionally, there's been a lot of work going on in the FPGAs called Open Acceleration Framework, OCXL, which really brings the OpenCAPI framework in the FPGA to connect memory and external networks into it, and also make it much more easy to program your FPGA with your application in C or HDL. And on the software side, we've got the software stack, including Python support. I should say that the OCXL, there's a presentation at 10:35 a.m. Central Time on track 2A to give you more details on this. And then we've got the DDIMM, the OMI DDIMM. Microchip actually made a buffer chip, and that's got less than 10 nanoseconds latency adder over a standard RDIMM. In terms of keeping that memory channel as efficient as possible for the processors. And today we can actually connect these OMI DDIMMs into the FPGA fabric to really amplify the memory bandwidth of the FPGA fabric. And to that end, Oscar Menzer from Maxeller will be giving a lightning talk on FPGA application acceleration of memory bound problems with OMI. It's going to be at the Birds of a Feather panel session at 1:20 p.m. Central Time today on track 2A again. The key thing to take away here is all of this I've just talked about is all the RTL in the software is proven and fully open sourced. So Looking a bit more into the hardware, the Power 9 systems that support OpenCAPI 3 include the IBM AC922 platform, which was #1 and #2 in the top 500 supercomputers for the last few years until recently. And then we've got the IC922 for bringing in storage dense servers and AI production, which also supports the OpenCAPI 3. So we've got some good server level products supporting the OpenCAPI environment. On the FPGA accelerator front, we've got a multitude of offerings from Alpha Data and Bitware, focusing on all acceleration use cases. Bitware's is more focused around the storage of different medias and attaching them to OpenCAPI to bring the different medias in from ZNAND and NAND devices. Whereas Alpha Data's is focusing more on the larger FPGAs, which also include the HBM Memory on package. And I'm delighted to say that Craig Petrie from Bitware will be giving a lightning talk at the Birds of a Feather panel session at 1:20 Central again on track 2A. So I encourage you to come along to that. So with all of that infrastructure we've got for quite a while now, we've got quite a few success stories here, and I won't go into them in details. If you look in the agenda, you will see these different tracks, which will give you some good examples of what you can do with this OpenCAPI framework. Going back to the OpenCAPI memory interface in a little bit more detail. Really what we're trying to do with OMI is we're trying to herd the divergent memory choices, because now everything can be treated as memory and we're wanting to increasingly treat it as memory, and so therefore we have to commonize these interconnects. The trades between these, which ones you choose for your system, are quite a multitude: depth versus latency versus bandwidth versus persistence versus power versus cost. And depending on which one you choose, you'll get a different balance of those factors. They all have their own unique interfaces. Not one of them is really compatible with the other. And so OMI is really trying to normalize those memory interfaces. And for now, whilst we can use no OMI memory buffer for these different interfaces, and that's what we're doing. So obviously the DDR4 OMI DDIMM is the critical one to get in place, and the latency is pretty damn fundamental on that one. And that's available today from Smart Modular, Samsung and Micron. And Bitware's 250 HMS has given us access to low latency NAND on the OpenCAPI bus. And Bitware's 250 SoC is also giving us access on the OpenCAPI bus to NAND via NVMe storage. So we've covered a good few of the bases here. And also, if that with the emerging memory that's coming out, there is an opportunity for these companies to actually support natively OMI on their devices, which will be a nice change moving forward. So, but why OMI? What is the OMI advantage over other approaches? One is it exists in production today, so that's a pretty compelling one. But the key thing here is you're getting memory bandwidth and depth at low cost. And so the way I'm showing this is the Power 10 die, and I'm representing it by how much you can get, how much memory bandwidth you can get on the I/O edge. So there's 8 OMI interface PHYs on the left edge and 8 on the right, and it takes up 12.7 millimeters of the die. This is all to scale that I'm going to show you, and they're all based on 7 nanometer process nodes. The AMD EPIC Rome I/O die has DDR4 memory channels at either end, and so it has 4 memory channels at one end, and you can see it's slightly bigger edge area for those 4 channels compared to the 8 OMI channels. Similarly, on the NVIDIA Ampere device, it's got 6 HBM2 channels, and 1 HBM is slightly smaller than the 8 OMI 5 channels on the Power 10, again 7 nanometers. But to really compare these, we need to look at the gigabytes per second of those channels. So 4 DDR4s is about 100 gigabytes per second on the EPIC. We're getting 400 gigabytes per second out of the 8 OMI DDIMM channels, and we're getting 311 gigabytes per second out of the HBM2 channel. So when we look at it as a gigabyte per second per millimeter parameter of edge die, you can see that OpenCAPI really does, the OMI really does win on all categories, significantly bandwidth-wise over DDR4, and surprisingly faster than the HBM2, which is really quite a surprise. And when it comes to depth, there is just no contest. With DRAM, the Power 9 is more than 2x of DDR4, and compared to the HBM, it's significantly greater because you're limited in capacity because it's on packaged memory. And OMI goes even further with different media types other than DDR4, like the 250 HMS. You can get to 1.9 terabytes per millimeter or greater. So this really is as compelling as it gets. In my entire career, I've not seen anything more compelling, and it's in production today. So it really is a no-brainer to adopt this technology. So we're not talking, this is no concept, this is reality. OpenCAPI is connecting the memory data plane continuum, and we can see it with Power 9 and soon to come Power 10, and the Xilinx UltraScale FPGAs and the Versa ones coming down the pipe. So really, I call to action here, put your processor here or your memory here in this fabric. This is definitely the best way to go if you want to shine with the technology you're offering. And remember, all the OpenCAPI and OMI RTL in software is proven and open sourced. So our journey though is still just really beginning. Please join the OpenCAPI and contribute back into our community. In summary, we do have this hybrid world that we've come from. It's been around for 15 years. Hybrids are not going away on the electric on the hybrid car front. And so maybe we've got a few more years left in this approach. But one thing's for sure is the purity of the data-centric approach is really a no-brainer for high-performance computing applications today. An absolute no-brainer. And the only thing I'd ask you to take away is whichever camp you sit in, the hybrid camp or the pure camp of data-centric computing, really look at your problems. Consider this data-centric template for your next domain-specific architecture. And if you look at your problem from this light, you will be able to come to the correct conclusions as to what is the best way to build your computing architectures. So thank you very much. May I encourage you all to come along to the Birds of a Feather panel session that I will be chairing at 1:20 Central Time and Track 2A. Thank you again.